Nathaniel Brooks was 38 years old, and on the day he married the woman he loved, he paid every dollar of the $380,000 wedding himself. The flowers, the catering, the 10-piece band, and the Virginia Vineyard, where 240 guests raised their glasses in his honor. A vineyard he quietly owned outright. Nobody at that reception knew that, especially not his new wife's family. To them, Nate was adequate at best. A modest man in an unremarkable suit who had no idea what he had married into. That evening, Patricia Whitfield stood on the terrace with her husband and her brother-in-law, champagne in hand, and called the man who had just paid for her daughter's dream wedding a broke loser, certain he had nothing worth taking, and already counting the days until they could take it. She had no idea Nate was standing on the other side of that glass door, hearing every word. So he made one phone call, and when his best man took that microphone, everything Patricia Whitfield thought she knew about the man her daughter married collapsed in front of 240 witnesses. She had no idea who she was dealing with, but she was about to find out. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Nate Brooks stood before the mirror in the bridal suite, methodically adjusting his bow tie. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting a warm glow across the hardwood floors of the vineyard's private quarters. His fingers moved with practiced precision, the same careful attention he brought to every aspect of his life. The $380,000 he'd spent on this wedding hadn't caused him a moment's hesitation. He'd written the checks quietly, declining Adrienne's offers to have her family contribute. The Whitfields had pushed back, of course, especially Patricia, with her pointed comments about allowing them to participate in their daughter's special day. But Nate had been firm, wrapping his insistence in gentle words about wanting to give Adrienne everything she deserved. As he smoothed down his jacket, his mind drifted back to their first meeting 3 years ago. The charity gala had been crowded, full of the usual networking and performative philanthropy. Nate had been there as a silent donor, standing near the back of the room when Adrienne approached with a glass of wine and a warm smile. "You look as thrilled to be here as I feel," she'd said, making him laugh despite himself. She'd pursued him with a gentle persistence after that. Coffee invitations, gallery openings, casual dinners where she never once asked about his work beyond his simple explanation of being in real estate and finance. When he'd deflected questions about his success, she'd seemed content to let him keep his privacy. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Jerome stepped in, already grinning. "Man, you actually managed to make that tie straight," his oldest friend said. "I was worried I'd have to fix it for you like I did at that first investor meeting back in '08. Nate smiled, remembering the nervous 23-year-old he'd been then, pitching his first real deal with $40,000 scraped together from 4 years of saving. "That meeting worked out all right." "That meeting worked out better than all right," Jerome said, adjusting his own tie. "But then, most things do when you take your time and do them right." Through the window, Nate could see guests beginning to arrive. The Whitfields were already there, of course. Patricia was directing the flower arrangements with the precise movements of a conductor, while Ronald followed in her wake, nodding agreeably at everything she said. Uncle Desmond stood off to the side, watching it all with what he probably thought was subtle calculation. "Your mom's here," Jerome said quietly. "She's got that look she gets when she's trying not to say something." Nate nodded. Gloria Brooks had raised him alone after his father left, teaching him the patience and discipline that had built his fortune. She'd been reserved when he told her about Adrienne, careful with her words in a way that had given him pause. But he'd been so careful himself, for so long. When Adrienne had broken through those walls, it had felt like finally letting go of old fears. He caught a glimpse of Adrienne through the window, disappearing into her own preparation room. Even at this distance, he could see the slight distraction in her movements, the way she kept checking her phone. Pre-wedding nerves, he'd assumed whenever he noticed it over the past weeks. Patricia intercepted her daughter, pulling her close for what looked like an intense conversation. Adrian nodded several times, her face serious, before forcing a bright smile and hurrying inside. Patricia watched her go, then turned to say something to Ronald and Desmond that made them both nod with equally serious expressions. The ceremony was still 2 hours away. Nate straightened his cuffs, sterling silver, understated, a graduation gift from his mother that meant more than any luxury brand. "I'm going to check the cocktail setup," he told Jerome. "Make sure everything's running smoothly." "Control freak," Jerome said affectionately. "Some things never change." Nate walked through the quiet halls of his vineyard, a fact known only to him, Jerome, and the property managers who maintained strict confidentiality. He'd bought it 6 years ago, through one of his holding companies, seeing the potential in its location and terroir. Like everything else in his life, he'd built it carefully, patiently, without fanfare. As he approached the terrace where the cocktail hour would be held, voices carried clearly through the glass doors. He stopped, his hand halfway to the handle, as Patricia's words cut through the morning air. 60 days. Desmond has the paperwork ready." Nate's hand froze on the door handle. Through the clear glass, he could see Patricia, Ronald, and Desmond clustered at the far end of the terrace. Morning sunlight caught the champagne in their glasses, casting small prisms across the stone floor. They stood close together, speaking in the unguarded way people do when they believe themselves completely alone. 60 days, Patricia said, taking a slow sip from her glass. "Desmond has the paperwork ready. We file citing irreconcilable differences, and we walk away with the house in her name, the joint account, and half of whatever modest savings this man has managed to scrape together." Ronald shifted uncomfortably, his champagne untouched. "You sure she can hold it together that long? She was crying in the limo on the way here." Patricia's lip curled with contempt. "She'll hold it together because I raised her right. This is what we've been working toward. He's a broke loser playing at success." She gestured broadly at the vineyard around them. "This venue? Probably rented on a credit card. That ring he gave her? Likely financed. He has nothing that a good attorney can't take." Desmond nodded, his disbarred attorney's confidence evident in his stance. "I've looked at what I could find publicly. Small LLC, some real estate holdings in Maryland, couple of commercial properties. Nothing that'll survive a clean divorce. The way I've structured the filing, we can—" "To Adrian," Patricia cut in, raising her glass in a mock toast. She did her part beautifully. 1. Nate stood perfectly still, his mind categorizing each revelation with mechanical precision. 2. The crying in the limo. Not wedding nerves. Guilt, maybe. Or fear of discovery. 3. 60 days. They had already planned the timeline. 4. The paperwork was ready. This wasn't opportunistic. This was orchestrated. 5. Adrian's gentle pursuit 3 years ago hadn't been chance. It had been strategy. 6. Her apparent contentment with his privacy had been calculation, not understanding. 7. Every time she'd deflected family questions about his business, she'd been playing a role. 8. The distracted looks at her phone. Coordination, not anxiety. 9. Her tears this morning weren't joy or nervousness. They were the weight of performance. 10. 3 years of what he thought was love had been an elaborate construction. 11. He had been carefully, precisely, professionally deceived. The morning sun felt suddenly sharp on his skin. He could hear the caterers setting up behind him, the band doing their sound check, the steady hum of 240 guests arriving for what they believed was a celebration of love. What the Whitfields saw as the culmination of a financial strategy. Through the glass, he watched Patricia laugh at something Desmond said, her teeth bright and predatory. Ronald was nodding along, the same agreeable head bob he'd been performing at family dinners for 3 years. Desmond had his hands in his pockets, rocking slightly on his heels with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd planned everything perfectly. The scale of their miscalculation would have been almost funny if it wasn't wrapped around the destruction of what Nate had believed was real love. They had spent 3 years targeting what they assumed were modest assets, never bothering to look deep enough to understand what they were really trying to steal. He watched them for another moment. These people who thought they had written the ending to this story. Patricia taking another satisfied sip of champagne. Ronald finally drinking his, probably to steady his nerves. Desmond checking his phone, likely reviewing some detail of their planned legal strategy. The only sound Nate could hear was his own measured breathing, the same calm, steady rhythm that had carried him through every major decision in his life. Every investment, every calculated risk, every patient step that had built what he actually owned. He turned away from the door without making a sound. His shoes made no noise on the polished floors as he walked through the quiet morning halls of his vineyard, past the bustling kitchen where the New Orleans catering team he'd flown in was preparing for the reception, past the ballroom where the 10-piece band was running through their set list, past all the carefully chosen details he'd paid for because he'd believed this day meant something true. He found a quiet corner of the garden, partially hidden by a flowering hedge. The morning air was cool and clean. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he scrolled to Jerome's number. 1 ring, 2, 3. "Hey man, everything okay?" Jerome's voice was instantly alert, reading something in the silence. Nate spoke 4 words, his voice as quiet and precise as the day he'd made his first investment. "Give the real speech." Jerome stood backstage in the reception hall, his hand moving to the right breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket, where the real speech had waited for 3 years. He'd written it the day after he first met Adrienne, when something in her careful questions about Nate's business had triggered 17 years of protective instinct. He'd revised it last week, updating the numbers, polishing the precision of each revelation. He walked to the microphone with the same steady composure he brought to board meetings. The band settled into silence. 240 guests turned their attention to the best man, expecting the usual mix of gentle ribbing and emotional tribute. "I met Nate Brooks 17 years ago," Jerome began, his voice warm and clear. "We were college roommates, and I knew from day one that this man was different. Not because he was flashy. Nate's never been flashy. Not because he talked about success. Nate's never been much for talking. But because every single morning, while the rest of us were sleeping off whatever we'd done the night before, Nate was already up, reading, planning, building." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. At the head table, Patricia sipped her champagne with polite disinterest. Ronald nodded along, performing attention. Desmond checked his phone under the table. "I watched him save $40,000 over 4 years, Jerome continued. Watched him make his first investment at 23, watched him turn that investment into another and another, while living in a studio apartment and driving a 10-year-old car. Because Nate never cared about looking successful. He cared about building something real. The Whitfield's attention was drifting now, exactly as Jerome had calculated. This sounded like the story of a small-time investor who'd managed modest success. Exactly what they thought they knew. "Most of you know Nate as a quiet man, a humble man." Jerome's tone shifted slightly, taking on the precision he used in corporate presentations. "And that's intentional, because Nate decided a long time ago that he would never let his wealth speak before his character did." Patricia's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. "But tonight, standing here, I think his character has spoken long enough." Jerome reached into his right breast pocket, withdrawing a single folded page. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. The room went still, sensing something changing in the air. Nathaniel Brooks is the founder and majority owner of Brooks Capital Group, a private equity and real estate holding company currently managing a portfolio valued at approximately $2.1 billion. The silence shattered. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jerome's voice remained steady, each word landing like a carefully placed stone. He owns 47 commercial properties across 9 states, a private equity fund with 32 active investors, and, just so nobody's confused about the venue tonight, this vineyard, which he has owned outright for 6 years. The narration moved from face to face, capturing the moment each person processed what they were hearing. Gloria Brooks sat with her hands folded in her lap, chin lifted slightly, the quiet dignity of a mother who had waited 3 years to see her son's truth revealed. She nodded once, a gesture containing decades of pride. Patricia's champagne glass hung suspended between table and lips, her carefully maintained composure cracking around the edges as she recalculated every assumption she'd built her scheme upon. Ronald's jaw had gone slack, his eyes darting between Jerome and Nate as the full scope of their miscalculation became devastatingly clear. Desmond's face had drained of color, the disbarred attorney's mind obviously racing through the implications of what they'd attempted to steal. And Adrian, the camera of narration, held on her the longest, capturing every micro-expression that crossed her face. There was no surprise, no shock at learning who her husband really was. Her features showed only rapid calculation, the quick adjustments of someone whose strategy had just been publicly dismantled. She had known. She had always known. Jerome finished with quiet authority. He paid for this wedding in full, because that is the kind of man he is. I just wanted everyone in this room to know exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. The silence that followed felt like crystal, sharp, clear, and ready to shatter. Nate rose smoothly from his seat, champagne glass in hand. He smiled at the room with the same quiet confidence he'd always carried, the same unassuming warmth that had never been an act. Then he turned that smile directly to Adrian. She met his gaze. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Morning light filtered through the hotel suite's curtains, casting soft shadows across the unmade bed. Nate sat in one of the room's plush chairs, already dressed in casual clothes, watching Adrienne move around the suite. She hadn't slept much. He'd heard her tossing all night, felt the tension radiating from her side of the bed. "I still can't believe Jerome did that," Adrienne said, her voice carrying the perfect mix of indignation and concern. "To expose our private business like that, in front of everyone." She paused in front of the mirror, adjusting her earring with steady fingers. He had no right. Nate said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. He'd spent the night cataloging every moment of their 3 years together, re-examining each conversation through the lens of what he now knew, the careful way she'd avoided certain topics, the gentle redirections whenever money came up, the practiced warmth that had never quite reached her eyes. "Mom's absolutely furious," Adrienne continued, turning to face him. "She thinks Jerome was trying to humiliate the family, make us look small." She moved closer, perching on the arm of his chair. "But that's not what matters. What matters is us, you and me." Her hand reached for his, and Nate allowed the contact. Her fingers were warm, steady, no trembling, no uncertainty. This was a performance she'd rehearsed. "I love you for who you are," she said softly. "The money doesn't change anything. I just wish you'd trusted me enough to tell me yourself." Nate studied her face, the earnest expression, the gentle concern in her eyes. 3 years ago, he would have believed every word. Now he saw the calculation behind each careful phrase. "Are you finished?" he asked quietly. Something flickered across her features. Surprise, maybe, or frustration at his failure to respond as expected. But she recovered quickly, squeezing his hand. "What do you mean?" Nate gently withdrew his hand from hers and reached down beside his chair. He lifted a manila folder, plain, unremarkable, but Adrian's eyes locked onto it immediately. "2 days before the wedding," he said, keeping his voice even, I received some interesting messages from Petra Thompson. The color drained from Adrienne's face. Petra, her college roommate, her former best friend, the one person who'd walked away from the Whitfield family's orbit after a falling out 6 months ago. She sent screenshots, Nate continued, opening the folder. 14 months of text messages between you and your mother, starting the week after we met. He placed the folder on the bed between them. The first page was face up, the messages clearly visible. Patricia, keep him comfortable. Keep him private. Make sure he doesn't bring lawyers into the relationship. Men like that get suspicious when you push prenups. Adrienne, he hasn't mentioned one. Patricia, of course he hasn't. He thinks he's modest. He doesn't know what modest means. Adrienne stared at the messages, her hands perfectly still in her lap. Page after page documented the careful orchestration of their entire relationship. Patricia's detailed instructions, Adrienne's progress reports, the cold calculation behind every warm moment they'd shared. You had me watched? Adrienne's voice sharpened, her gentle performance evaporating. You went through my private messages. Had your people spy on my family? Petra sent these voluntarily, Nate said quietly. No one asked her. No one paid her. She just decided the truth needed to come out. The truth? Adrienne stood abruptly, anger replacing her earlier warmth. The truth is, you've been lying to me for 3 years about who you really are. The truth is, you let me believe we were building something modest together, while you sat on billions. The truth is, you humiliated my entire family at our wedding. She was moving now, pacing the room with controlled fury. Not once did she deny the message's content. Not once did she address their meaning. Her entire defense was attack, exactly as Patricia had trained her. Nate stood, gathering the folder with careful movements. Camille will be in touch Monday morning. Nate! Adrienne's voice cracked slightly, the first genuine emotion he'd heard from her in 14 months. Don't you dare walk away from me. We need to talk about this. He reached the door, his hand resting on the handle. In the mirror beside the door, he could see her reflection, the mask of anger slipping, revealing something that might have been fear. Nate, please. He opened the door and stepped through, closing it quietly behind him. Her voice followed him down the hallway, but he didn't turn around. His footsteps were steady as he walked to his car, each movement calm and deliberate. 20 minutes later, he pulled into his mother's driveway. Gloria Brooks opened the door before he reached it, took one look at his and wordlessly pulled him into a hug. Monday morning brought a crisp autumn chill to downtown Baltimore. Nate parked his modest sedan in his reserved spot, a simple B marking the space rather than his name, and took the elevator to the 12th floor. The sign beside the frosted glass doors read, Brooks Consulting Group, a carefully chosen name that was technically accurate while revealing nothing. Inside, the office hummed with quiet efficiency. The space was well-appointed but understated, exactly what you'd expect from a successful but unremarkable consulting firm. Only the corner office, with its impressive view of the harbor, hinted at something more. Camille Okafor stood as Nate entered, her tailored suit and composed demeanor reflecting the precision she brought to everything. 2 neat stacks of folders sat on the conference table, each labeled with meticulous care. You look like you haven't slept, Nate observed, closing the door behind him. Sleep is for lawyers who don't have 48 hours to map a family conspiracy, Camille replied, the faintest smile touching her lips. Coffee? Nate shook his head, settling into one of the leather chairs. What did you find? Camille opened the first folder, her movements deliberate. The scheme goes deeper than the marriage. Your future in-laws have been quite busy. She slid several documents across the table. Ronald Whitfield has spent the last 6 weeks approaching your commercial tenants. Nate's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. Which ones? Marcus Chen at the Howard Street complex, and David Sullivan at the Baltimore Street offices. Camille's voice remained steady. Ronald approached them separately, implying you were planning to liquidate properties after the wedding. He suggested they should consider exploring their options before any ownership transition, trying to destabilize the tenant relationships, Nate said quietly. Reduce the assessed income value before the divorce. Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. Camille pulled out 2 more documents. Both Chen and Sullivan contacted Tom in property management immediately. They've known you for years. Chen since you helped him expand his business into that space. Sullivan since you personally negotiated his lease terms. They knew something was wrong. And Tom told you. He came to me the same day. We documented everything. Dates, times, exact quotes from the conversations. Ronald was clumsy about it, left plenty of evidence. She paused. He clearly had no idea who he was actually dealing with. Nate absorbed this, his face impossible to read. What's our exposure? Camille opened the second folder, revealing a complex organizational chart. None. Every property Ronald targeted is held in trusts established between 2008 and 2012. The holding company structure predates your relationship with Adrienne by 11 years. There's nothing for them to reach. She spread out additional documents, trust agreements, corporate filings, asset protection structures built with meticulous care over more than a decade. They spent a year planning to rob a vault they never had the combination to. Even if Adrienne filed for divorce tomorrow, even with the best attorneys in the state, she couldn't touch any of it. And the tenant interference? Documented tortious interference with business relationship. We have statements from both tenants, Tom's contemporaneous notes, and follow-up emails Ronald was foolish enough to send. Camille's voice carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had built an airtight case. If we choose to pursue it, the damages could be substantial. Nate stood, walking to the window. The harbor stretched before him, morning sun glinting off the water. Behind him, Camille waited patiently. She'd known him long enough to recognize when he was processing. "Prepare everything," he said finally, still looking out at the water. "Full legal action package. Document the interference, draft the civil complaints, prepare the demand letters, but file nothing yet." Camille nodded, making notes. "And Adrienne?" "I'm going home tonight," Nate said, turning back to face her. "I'll be warm, composed, exactly as I've always been. She has no idea we know about Ronald's tenant contacts or the asset structure. Let's keep it that way." "The 60-day clock they planned," Camille said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're going to let them play it out." "A plan in motion generates evidence," Nate replied simply, "and they've already given us plenty to work with." He gathered his coat, his movements unhurried. "Keep building the file. I want everything ready when they make their move." "Nate," Camille called as he reached the door, "be careful. Living with someone who's actively deceiving you, it takes a toll." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with now. That makes it easier." With that, he stepped out, leaving Camille with her folders and the weight of what they'd discovered. The hardest part wasn't pretending. The hardest part was doing it perfectly. For 8 weeks, Nate maintained the precise rhythm of their married life. Morning coffee together before Adrienne left for her teaching job. Casual texts during the day. Dinner conversations about her students' art projects, and his deliberately vague meetings. He wasn't acting. He was being exactly who he'd always been, just with full awareness now of what lay beneath the surface. Behind the scenes, Jerome moved with surgical precision. He arranged private meetings with Nate's 5 largest investment partners, briefing them on the situation without revealing more than necessary. A personal matter requiring additional documentation was how he framed it. Each partner signed updated agreements strengthening their commitment to the holding company structure. The 2 affected tenants, Marcus Chen and David Sullivan, met with Jerome personally. Both men were angry, not at Nate, but at Ronald's clumsy attempt to manipulate them. They provided detailed statements about Ronald's approaches and signed new 10-year leases with enhanced protection clauses. Your father-in-law tried to imply Nate was unstable, Chen told Jerome during their meeting. After what Nate did to help me expand, man doesn't know who he's dealing with. Jerome documented everything meticulously. Every conversation, every email, every scrap of evidence showing Desmond's involvement in drafting legal documents while disbarred. The file grew thicker by the day. Halfway through this careful dance, Gloria Brooks visited the house on a Sunday afternoon. Adrian was at her mother's. These Sunday visits to Patricia had become more frequent lately, though Nate now understood why. He was in the kitchen when his mother arrived, making the coffee exactly how she liked it. "You look tired, baby," Gloria said, settling into her usual chair at the counter. She didn't need to ask if they were alone. She knew her son wouldn't have asked her to come if Adrienne was there. Nate set her coffee down and leaned against the counter. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, steadily, he told her everything. The wedding revelations, the text messages, Ronald's clumsy attempts with the tenants, the careful legal trap they thought they were laying. Gloria listened without interruption, her hands folded calmly around her coffee cup. When he finished, she didn't immediately offer advice or solutions. She didn't need to. She'd raised him to solve his own problems. "You remember what I taught you about anger?" she asked finally. "That it's a compass, not a destination," Nate replied. The same words she'd told him when he was 9 and his father left, when he was 15 and faced racism at school, when he was 23 and made his first investment, driven partly by the determination to never be powerless. "That's right." Gloria sipped her coffee. "Anger shows you what matters, but what you do with it, that's what matters more." "I'm not acting from anger, Mama." "I know you're not. That's why I'm not worried." She reached across the counter and took his hand. "You've always known how to build things properly. Even this, you're building it right. Clean. Careful. They tried to take everything I built. No, baby. They tried. But they never could have succeeded." Gloria's voice carried absolute certainty. "You built all of this the same way you've built everything, with discipline and forethought. They thought they were targeting a house made of cards. They found a fortress instead." Nate squeezed his mother's hand. "I have to let it play out. Let them think they're succeeding until the moment they realize they never could have." "I know." Gloria stood, coming around the counter to hug her son. "Just remember, be better than your anger. Not because they deserve it, but because you do." "That's exactly what I'm being, Mama," Nate said softly. "That's exactly what I'm being." 10 days later, on day 58 of what the Whitfields thought was their carefully planned timeline, Adrienne came home early. Nate was in his home office reviewing documents Jerome had sent over. "Nate?" Her voice carried the gentle hesitation he now recognized as performance. "Can we talk? There are some things we should discuss." He looked up, meeting her eyes with the same warm attention he'd always given her. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Later that night, after Adrienne had gone to bed, Nate sat in his darkened office and made a single call. "Camille, she's starting. Have everything ready." 2 days passed like molasses. Adrienne had spent them mostly on her phone, speaking in hushed tones with her family, while Nate maintained his usual routine. He knew exactly what was coming. He'd known for 58 days. When Adrienne entered his home office that morning, she carried a manila envelope with practiced casualness. Her composure was perfect, shoulders relaxed, expression gentle but firm. Nate recognized the performance for what it was now. Something rehearsed in front of Patricia, refined by Desmond, practiced until it felt natural. "I've given this a lot of thought," Adrienne began, settling into the chair across from his desk. Her voice had that careful modulation he'd heard at parent-teacher conferences. Emotional without being emotional, and I think we need to be honest about where we are. Nate set aside the document he'd been reviewing. I'm listening. She withdrew papers from the envelope, sliding them across his desk with steady hands. I filed for divorce this morning. This is a separation agreement that I think is fair to both of us. I'd like you to review it. Nate picked up the document. Desmond's work was evident in every paragraph, clinical language mapping out their supposed joint assets, demanding the marital home and specific properties Desmond believed were personal holdings. The cash settlement figure was precise: $2.4 million. I know this might feel sudden, Adrian continued, following what was clearly a prepared script. But I think we both know we want different things. You're so focused on work, on building your business. She paused, as if searching for the right words. I need something different. Someone more present, more engaged in building a real life together. Nate let the silence stretch for exactly 10 seconds. He could see Adrian fighting the urge to fill it, to keep performing the role she'd rehearsed. Are you finished? He asked quietly. Something in his tone made her hesitate. I just think this is the most respectful way to— I know what this is, Adrian. He reached into his desk drawer and removed a leather portfolio. From it, he extracted a single document, Camille's legal memorandum, meticulously detailing the ownership structure of every asset the separation agreement targeted. The marital home exists within the Brooks Family Trust, established 11 years before our marriage, he said, his voice remaining conversational. The 3 commercial properties you've listed are owned by Brooks Capital Holdings, LLC, also predating our marriage by 11 years. There are no joint business interests, because every business interest is held within the corporate structure of Brooks Capital Group, which you have no legal claim to. Adrian's carefully maintained expression cracked slightly. Nate, He held up a hand, then placed a second document on the desk. This is a formal notification of intent to pursue tortious interference claims against Ronald Whitfield and Desmond Whitfield, regarding their documented attempts to interfere with tenant relationships at 1820 Market Street and 455 Commerce Avenue. The color drained from Adrian's face. Her hands, still perfectly manicured, began to tremble. Both Marcus Chen and David Sullivan provided detailed statements about Ronald's approaches, Nate continued. They were quite thorough in recounting how he implied I was planning to liquidate properties, attempting to destabilize lease agreements before what he called an upcoming transition in ownership. Adrian grabbed her phone, fingers shaking as she speed-dialed Patricia. The phone's speaker was loud enough for Nate to hear every word. Mama, we have a problem. He knows. He knows everything. Patricia's voice came through with its usual commanding tone. Stick to the script, darling. He's trying to intimidate you. The agreement is solid. The properties are in trusts, Adrian cut in. Everything's in trusts, or the holding company. Desmond was wrong about the asset structure, and he has documentation about Daddy talking to the tenants. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had lost its confidence. What documentation? Signed statements. He's filing interference claims against Daddy and Uncle Desmond. Another silence, longer this time. When Patricia finally responded, her voice was barely audible. Put him on the phone. I'll communicate through Camille Okafor from this point forward, Nate said, loud enough to carry through the speaker. She'll coordinate everything. He collected both documents, returned them to his portfolio, and stood. Camille will contact Desmond directly about next steps. I suggest you all retain separate counsel. Without waiting for a response, he walked out of his own office, leaving Adrian still holding the phone, Patricia's silence filling the room behind him. 1 week had passed since the office confrontation. Nate sat in Camille's downtown conference room, watching through the glass wall as Patricia Whitfield made her entrance. She wore status like armor, designer suit, perfect makeup, chin held high. Ronald trailed behind her, sweating already in his ill-fitting jacket. Desmond brought up the rear, clutching his briefcase like a shield. The conference room spoke wealth in the quiet way Nate preferred. Understated furniture, clean lines, city views through floor-to-ceiling windows. Camille sat to his left, documents arranged with surgical precision. Jerome occupied his right, radiating the calm focus of a man who had waited months for this moment. Against the far wall, Gloria Brooks sat perfectly straight in a simple chair, hands folded in her lap, saying nothing. Her presence alone carried weight. Patricia swept in first, performing graciousness. "Nathaniel, darling, thank you for arranging this. I'm sure we can sort out these unfortunate misunderstandings." Nate gestured to the chairs across the table. "Please, sit." They arranged themselves, Patricia center, Ronald and Desmond flanking her. The briefcase made a hollow sound as Desmond set it down. "I appreciate you all coming," Nate began, his voice carrying the same tone he used in board meetings. "I want to walk you through exactly what we know, so there's complete clarity about our position." He opened a leather portfolio. "We'll start with the timeline. 14 months ago, the week after I met Adrienne, these text messages began." He slid copies across the table. "Patricia, you instructed Adrian to, quote, keep him comfortable, keep him private, make sure he doesn't bring lawyers into the relationship." Patricia started to speak. Camille raised one finger. "He's still speaking." Nate continued through the documented evidence with methodical precision. Each piece landed like a quiet hammerstroke. The coordinated courtship strategy, Ronald's tenant approaches, Desmond's legal preparations. He quoted dates, times, specific language from texts and emails. The narrative was airtight. 4 months ago, he said, Desmond began using casual dinner conversations to map what he believed was my asset structure. Adrienne relayed information without realizing its purpose. That information shaped the separation agreement's targeting of specific properties. Patricia tried again to interrupt. Camille's voice carried just enough edge. "Still speaking." 2 months ago, Ronald approached Marcus Chen and David Sullivan, attempting to destabilize tenant relationships at 2 properties. Both tenants documented these conversations immediately. Nate placed their signed statements on the table. The intent was to reduce assessed property values before divorce proceedings. The room remained silent as Nate closed his portfolio. Patricia seized the moment, leaning forward with practiced concern. "Nathaniel, I think there's been a real misunderstanding about our intentions." "Patricia," Nate cut in quietly, "I want to be precise with you, because I think clarity is the most respectful thing I can offer. What you did was coordinated financial fraud. What Desmond did may constitute multiple violations of his former bar license and opens him to civil liability in excess of what your family collectively holds in assets. What Ronald did is documentable tortious interference, and what Adrienne did was execute a 14-month scheme against a man who loved her." He let that sink in for 3 seconds, then reached for one final folder. "I'm not here to destroy your family. I'm here to make sure you understand, with the same clarity you tried to apply to my finances, what happens next if you proceed." Opening the folder, he revealed Camille's research into Patricia's financial position. "You've borrowed against your home's equity 6 times in 8 years, funding Ronald's business ventures. The most recent loan was 3 months ago. You're carrying $847,000 in debt against a property valued at $920,000. Patricia's face went ash-gray. This wasn't just exposure, it was the collapse of her carefully maintained family fiction. "You're not wealthy people targeting comfortable assets," Nate said softly. "You're a family in financial freefall who tried to use your daughter as a lifeline. And you chose exactly the wrong target." Desmond spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" "I want a clean, uncontested divorce. I want Adrienne to sign a comprehensive release. And I want you and Ronald to sign acknowledgement letters, not admissions, just acknowledgement that these communications occurred, which will remain in my attorney's file unless I need them. And if we don't?" Nate looked at him for a long moment, Then I stop being the quiet man. Camille pushed documents across the table. One by one, they signed. Ronald's signature was messy. Desmond's was precise, but small. Patricia signed last, her manicured hand trembling visibly. They filed out without another word. First Ronald, then Desmond supporting Patricia's elbow. The glass door closed behind them with a soft click. Nate remained seated, watching through the glass wall as they walked to the elevator, entered, and disappeared behind chrome doors. 2 days after the conference room meeting, Nate heard Adrienne's car pull into the driveway. He stood at the kitchen window, watching her sit motionless behind the wheel for almost a minute before finally opening her door. She had brought empty boxes. He could see them stacked in her back seat. One carload was all Camille's agreement allowed, as the house existed entirely within Nate's premarital trust. He didn't have to be here. He chose to be. Adrienne used her key, for the last time, and stepped into the foyer. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back simply. Without her family's careful staging and Desmond's legal coaching, she looked younger, almost lost. "I didn't expect you to be home," she said quietly. "I know." Nate remained in the kitchen doorway. "But this felt important enough to be present for." She nodded, then gestured vaguely toward the stairs. "I'll start upstairs. Just personal things." "Take what matters to you," Nate said. "The agreement covers specifics, but I'm not going to count shirts or argue about books." Adrienne's hands twisted together, a gesture he'd seen 100 times over 3 years, but now wondered if it had been practiced too. "Nate, He waited. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "I never meant—" She stopped again. Something real was trying to surface. He could see it in her face, the way her careful mask slipped just slightly. For a moment, she looked like she might actually say something true, something that approached genuine acknowledgement. Then she pulled back. The mask slid back into place. Whatever honest thing had been fighting its way up disappeared beneath years of Patricia's coaching and her own practiced performance. Nate watched this retreat and felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, the wound was far too fresh for that, but the release of expectation. He had been waiting, he realized, to see who Adrienne actually was when all the scaffolding fell away. Now he knew. The performance wasn't a layer she wore. It was fundamental to who she had become. She moved through the house methodically, filling boxes with clothes and personal items. Nate remained downstairs, letting her work without his presence, adding pressure to every choice. He heard her footsteps above, the soft sounds of drawers opening and closing, the occasional pause that might have been memory or might have been calculation. An hour passed. She carried boxes downstairs one by one, arranging them by the door. The pile was smaller than he expected. 3 years of marriage distilled into what would fit in her modest sedan. As she placed the final box down, she turned to face him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Did you ever really love me?" Her voice cracked slightly. "Any of it. Was it ever real for you?" Nate looked at her for a long moment, seeing both the woman he had loved and the instrument of betrayal she had chosen to become. "Every day," he said finally. "That's the part your family never understood and never will. That loving someone honestly isn't the same as being a mark. They thought my warmth was weakness. It was just character. And you can't take character from a person. You can only reveal your own." Adrienne flinched as if he'd struck her, though his voice remained gentle. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then picked up the nearest box. Nate stepped forward to open the door for her. The next 10 minutes passed in silence as she loaded her car. Each trip between house and driveway felt weighted with finality. When the last box was placed, she stood by the driver's door, keys clutched too tightly in her hand. She looked like she might speak again. Nate waited, but whatever words she might have found remained unspoken. She got into her car, started the engine, and backed carefully down the driveway. Nate stood in the doorway until her taillights disappeared around the corner. Then he closed the door, walked to the living room, and sat in his favorite chair. For the first time in 60 days, genuine silence wrapped around him. Not emptiness, but the specific stillness of a man who has finished something completely. 14 months later, Nate stood on the vineyard terrace where everything had changed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the same stone tiles where Patricia Whitfield had once dismissed him as a broke loser. Now, the space held different energy. The warm buzz of conversation from 40 of Brooks Capital Group's top investors mingled with the soft music drifting up from the garden below. He adjusted his cufflinks, simple silver ones Gloria had given him for his last birthday, and surveyed the gathering. Jerome moved easily through the crowd, his natural warmth making complex financial discussions feel like conversations between friends. Camille sat with 3 new investors, her precise language laying out opportunity structures with characteristic clarity. At a corner table, Gloria Brooks watched it all with quiet satisfaction. She caught Nate's eye and gave him the small nod that had always meant more than words between them. She wore a deep blue dress that matched her dignity, her silver hair elegant in the fading light. Her presence anchored the room in exactly the way Nate had hoped it would. The past 14 months had reshaped everything, not through dramatic gestures but through the steady accumulation of consequences, the same way Nate had built his empire in the first place. Ronald Whitfield's business collapse came first. The 2 prospective partners he'd been courting withdrew immediately upon learning of the potential legal action. Without their promised investment, his latest venture, something involving automated retail kiosks, imploded within 8 months. The man who had performed wealth at Nate's wedding now couldn't secure a business loan in 3 states. Desmond's fall took longer, but cut deeper. The attorney-tenant Ronald had approached turned out to have a particularly strong opinion about disbarred lawyers giving unauthorized legal advice. His bar complaint, filed independently, without any prompting from Nate, triggered an investigation that was still ongoing. Desmond's name had become toxic in legal circles. The man who had drafted papers to strip Nate's assets now couldn't get his calls returned by paralegals. Patricia's foreclosure notice arrived 6 months after the divorce finalized. All those secret loans against the family home's equity, taken to fund Ronald's failing ventures, finally came due. The woman who had orchestrated a scheme to seize Nate's wealth now lived in her sister's spare bedroom in Baltimore. Her careful social performance had crumbled. She no longer attended the charity events where she had once held court. Adrienne was teaching art again at a different middle school across the city. Nate had heard this through Jerome, who maintained quiet awareness of the Whitfields' movements as a matter of security rather than vengeance. The narration noted this fact simply, without judgment or contempt. She had made her choices. She lived with them. Nate's own choices had moved in different directions. The community development fund he'd been quietly planning for 3 years finally launched, $50 million dedicated to affordable commercial real estate across Baltimore, Richmond, Norfolk, and Washington, D.C. The kind of work that never made headlines, because Nate had never sought headlines, but he had stopped hiding. Not performing, not broadcasting, just no longer feeling the need to conceal quite so much. He'd allowed Jerome and Camille to list him in a regional business journal's annual finance feature. He'd spoken at an industry conference, sharing insights about sustainable urban development that earned him standing-room-only attendance at every subsequent panel. Most significantly, he'd started having Sunday dinners with Gloria every week, telling her things about his life he'd never shared before. He realized he had been so focused on protecting himself from people who wanted what he had that he'd occasionally deprived himself of people who simply wanted him. The investor retreat was winding down now. The sun hung low over the vineyard rows, painting the grapes with amber light. Staff moved discreetly through the space, clearing glasses and plates. A few guests lingered, savoring both the wine and the rare opportunity to speak candidly with one of the Mid-Atlantic's most private business leaders. Jerome found him on the terrace, the exact spot where 14 months ago Nate had stood frozen behind glass doors, listening to his world unravel. Now the space felt different, cleaner, like somewhere a new story could begin. "You doing all right?" Jerome asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. Nate looked out over the vineyard, his vineyard, which it had always been going to be, and felt the specific peace of a man who had built everything he had, protected everything he built, and remained, through all of it, exactly who he had decided to be. "I'm doing exactly what I always do, Jerome," Nate said. "I'm moving forward. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.